This week's topic is prompted by a question I had from people who are attending a retreat that I'll be teaching at. And one of the questions was, what do I do about ugly selvage stitches? Now generally when someone's asking that question, they're not really asking about the selvage stitch, they're asking about the next two columns in. And when I clarified it, they were indeed asking about the selvage stitches. Now, for 99% of the projects you do, it doesn't matter if your selvage stitches are ugly or not, because what I'm going to be doing is if I seam this, if I were to seam this piece, I would be seaming here, and those ugly overlarge selvage stitches would be hidden, or I would be picking up a band along that side. So I would never see them. And by the way, here's my overlarge selvage stitches, and here's one where I've actually taken some care to make them nicer. Now, projects in garter stitch are one area where you really do need to worry about selvage stitches, because notice how overlarge these are, and it creates kind of an ugly edge. Up here, from this point on, I've taken care to make sure that they match the size of the stitches above. So, if you are concerned about your selvage stitches, don't spend too much time. If it's impacting this column of stitches, then you need to do something about it. But otherwise, they can just be ugly. They're half of a stitch, and they're not connected on the other side. And the other time you might be concerned is if I'm working something in a really bulky yarn, where if I were to place a seam here, it would just make that seam too thick. You can actually seam in the selvage stitch, and if you pull these guys apart, you can see that they form half of a knit stitch here, and in that case I would want a neat selvage stitch if I were going to be seaming there. Now if you have a project where you are going to have a raw edge and it's not going to be have stitches picked up where it's going to be seamed, you can slip the first stitch, and I'll demonstrate this in a second. And what it does is it gives you this kind of edge on the side, and this hasn't been blocked, that looks like a bind-off edge. And isn't that lovely? Now, there's some problems with it, you can see. It really looks nasty right here. This is that kind of problem I was talking about, where you have this column of stitches that's very ugly. It is very difficult, if you're using this technique, to have this column of stitches look neat. And notice how it looks really nice up here? Well, that's because I took a tapestry needle and I shifted all of the yarn. Now, you would never, ever, ever want to do this in a project that is going to be seamed or have stitches picked up. Seaming, okay, maybe you could get by with it, but picking up stitches, it would be a disaster, because these loops represent 2 rows, and these loops represent 1 stitch. And if I were picking up stitches along here, it would give me a very puckered band. You need to have a good selvage to provide support. Also, look how you could have little holes on that selvage. Well, let's talk about how I can get a neater selvage stitch, if it is a big deal for you. And it is just this simple. When you go to knit that first stitch, there's my selvage. Just give it a little tug. Just make sure that I don't have a big old loopy stitch. If I were to go right now, notice that the stitch is larger. It's going to give me an uglier selvage stitch. But if I just give it a slight little tug, and I do not mean yank, 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 because all that does is pull yarn from the previous row. Just a slight little tug. Now, if you do have problems with these other stitches, with your selvages, after you've worked 2 or 3, just pull a little tight. And what that does is it pulls yarn from these stitches without pulling it from the previous row. And that will make that really can help the appearance of those stitches in from the selvage. All right, and now I'm going to, and I'm just going to give it just a slight little tug, just a little tug to get rid of the excess yarn. And work to the end. It is very humid here today, and boy is this yarn sticky, and I'm using metal needles, so you think it would be sliding all over. Oof. I tend to have much tighter tension when it's humid like this. Now, When you get to the end of the row, try not to stretch out the stitches. That really can improve it as well. And now I'm going to work one more row. Just going to tighten it a bit and work to the end. Now if I do want to, all those little dings you are hearing are my text messages that I'm going to go look at when I'm done. Okay, and you can see that that selvage is pretty tight. Now what if I do want that selvage edge? It is just as easy as can be. I slip the first stitch of a row purlwise, and then I work to the end of the row. Now here's where you do want to tighten up a little bit, and that can help that tension issue that we're seeing. But honestly, it's really hard when you have a tension to fix that tension other than doing it after the fact. You can see that that loop is slightly larger. Slip it purlwise even though it's the knit side. God, it's like knitting underwater in here today. Joys of living in the South. Okay, and you can see that you get those bigger loops. And you just repeat that until you're done. And it gives you that nice little edging, which again looks like a bind off row, but it's not because it's over 2 rows, not 1 stitch. And maybe this would help. Yep, that helped. I tend not to put yarn on the floor because my dear sweet George thinks it's an invitation to come and play with it, but he's sleeping somewhere, I guess. And so on. So again, I wouldn't worry too much about my selvage stitches themselves. They are ugly. They're going to be ugly. That is not a problem. You want to worry about this column of stitches. And you can see that those stitches tend to get a little large, but how I can fix them is I can go down and I can pull this pinch stitch, and that's going to make it look a lot better.